All right, let's get the track started. Hopefully you're all going to be able to stay. This is kind of the last track of the OCP Summit, right? So Nill and I will try to cover the Open System Firmware project update and future directions. Nill, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. No. This is Nill from Bytedance. I'm the firmware architecture. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Dongwei. I'm on the steering committee representing the Open System Firmware project. I think Nill was the co-chair for the last couple of years.
It's okay.
Okay. Yeah, so Sami Nachimoto was another co-chair for the last 2 years as well. He couldn't make it today, so it will be just Nill and I covering for this session. So I mentioned the open system firmware in the previous slide, right? But we have been having some additional discussions in the project that it seems like the system firmware, although it continues to be a focal point, but we think that it's not enough, sufficient to cover the firmware that's in the server systems. So we have changed the scope in this project to expand to the platform firmware. So we have expanded the scope and we renamed the project. If you go to the OCP website, you can see this change, and there you may still see some remnants of OSF in some areas. So, but you can treat them as the same. In terms of the scope change, we are still supporting all the processor architectures, x86 and ARM, for example, and basically, all these architectures that are found in the web scale data centers. We also support all the cloud operating systems. We want to support the compute, storage and network devices as well as part of this expansion of the scope. We want to look into the development and deployment tools, of course also the security features in addition. The project meets supposedly weekly, right? Well, bi-weekly in terms of the geographic areas, but alternating between the APAC and non-APAC areas as well. So you're welcome to join these conferences. It's on Thursdays in the morning in Pacific time for non-APAC regions. That doesn't work very well for the APAC side. So we also have Wednesday night, 8 to 9 p.m. here in Pacific time zone, but it works very well for the APAC regions. So as we expand the scope to cover the platform firmware, we identify some new areas of focus. Some of these topics will be covered in the following sessions this afternoon. So silicon initialization interface integration issues and next steps, right? So as I mentioned earlier, you cover, a lot of processor architectures now, Intel, AMD, and ARM-based SoCs. There are challenges for the cloud vendors as well as the ODM OEMs in terms of integrating the system silicon initialization code. So there will be sessions on those areas coming up. Also, system firmware interactions with other OCP projects, right? We don't want to be too siloed in only looking at the firmware side of things. There are many things, related to security, related to, RAS support, related to many other areas of the systems that are very important, and we need to have system, the firmware support for these kind of areas. So system firmware will look into the pre-boot areas, the boot phases, the runtime and shutdown, and try to cover many different areas as well. Also, chiplet is a very popular topic these days, right? And inside of OCP, you have the chiplet economy, marketplace type of effort going on. In the industry, you have UCIe and many other efforts. So how that impacts the firmware designs is another topic that we will want to cover. Of course, the security, as I mentioned earlier, firmware contributes to that quite a bit. And associated with that, and also with the natural need of integrating more features along the way, the firmware update mechanisms will have to be dealt with and also securely dealt with. Of course, we also want to help support the sustainability of this OCP ecosystem. I want to pass to Nill to talk a little bit about how the OSF firmware have been dealt with in some of his experiences.
Thank you. Thanks, Don. Yeah, before Don and talk, in the last years, we have extended the OSF scope. We have renamed to the OPF, Open Platform Firmware, and extend the scope for more. Before we focus on the host firmwares, so I would like to update a little bit of status about the host firmware. So before for the host firmware, we generate separately 3 parts: silicon support module, bootloader, and a payload. So and then we have interface for OS handoff. So for the silicon support modules, we have the FSP from Intel, OpenCL from AMD, TFA from ARM, and from the bootloaders. Before, most of the solution right now we use the EDK2, but right now we have the options for the core boot, slim boot, U-boot. Yeah, for the payload, yeah. But maybe right now most of the solutions are focused on the EDK2. So maybe in the future you have another option for Linux boot. So anyway, the interface between the firmware and the OS is still keep the UEFI. So we would like to have the same interface. We have different firmware options. So in last few years, we have trying to promote another firmware solution options. So I'd like to do a quick update for the silicon support modules. So Intel FSP API mode, the POR from the next product. For AMD OpenCL POR from next product. That's very good news. Another one for the ARM platforms, TFA for the silicon code, and SBBR, IBBR for the reference implementations. Yeah, that's great news. Another one is for the system deployment. A very appreciate the integrated collaboration with Bytedance. So Bytedance have deployed over 15,000 systems with corporate and input solutions. Additional, we have a few thousand systems with Linux EDK2 with Linux boot solutions on data center. So far, the system works well. So another one is Linux boot also have been separately used for the OS installation with IPv6 support. Yeah. So and we still have the one opening community still follow silicon support the consistent interface. Yeah, because right now the Intel or AMD or ARM we have different silicon module interface between the bootloader and the silicon support module. So the community is still working on the consistent interface. Yeah.
Okay, so let me continue that. Right now for the OPF, the Open Platform Firmware project, we have a number of work streams that are under considerations. So if you have inputs, feel free to engage with the project. We are planning to look into the, like I mentioned, the chiplet impact to the firmware support. We want to look into a little bit more on the firmware update side, utilizing some of the mechanisms that we have put in place. And like Nill was mentioning earlier, there are cloud vendors and OEM ODMs wanting to look at somewhat unified silicon initialization interfaces to ease the adoption of multiple processor architectures. There's also a work stream that's being planned to look into the unified platform configurations. Right now, different platforms use different terminologies, different configurations, mechanisms for very similar features. So that also impacts the wide adoption of of these different systems in the data center. Also, firmware security, right? It's also always important. So the OCP, Foundation has done a re-election of the project leads, the co-chairs, in the summer. So moving on from this point on, we will have Raj Kapoor from AMD and Jean-Marie Verdun from HPE, and also Sami Nachimoto. Sami has retired from Intel, but he wanted to continue to help us in an individual capacity. So the three individuals here on the slide are going to be the co-chairs of the OPF project moving forward. So as I mentioned earlier, there are multiple work streams being considered. So we certainly want to have work stream leads to help cover these areas. So new work stream leads will be elected once the work streams are finalized and approved by the OCP Foundation. So more opportunities for more people to volunteer the services here. We're not going to give you a salary for this, but we certainly need your help because even if even after we have three co-chairs now, there are more than three projects, work streams going on, right?
Another one is in afternoon we have a panel discussing about these work streams. So if you are interested, you have experience, yeah, you can just.
Yeah, so later on we have a panel discussion, so please join, and then we should have more interactions for ideas. And if you want to volunteer now, you can engage either Nill or myself, and we can have discussions. Or actually, Raj and Jean-Marie are in the audience. I think I saw Jean-Marie here. Is Raj here as well, somewhere?
He will be right here. So
probably he will join us later on. All right, you want to talk about the call to action? Okay, all right, I'll continue. So call to action for this session is OPF, the Open Platform Firmware, is driving open, secure, standard-based, easily integrated solution, sustainable firmware, right? So the scope has been expanded, as I talked about, to include the platform scope of the system. So it's not just the BIOS or the system firmware, it's about the devices and other areas as well. So please join the OPF project and the work streams that I talked about. If you have other ideas about work streams, please talk to the volunteers. And here's the link to this Open Platform Firmware URL website. Thank you. Are there any questions for Nill and myself? Yeah.
When you say platform scope, could you elaborate a little bit more about some specifics about what you mean by platform scope? What's going to be included in that? What's not?
Yeah, so I think the difference between the term system firmware and the term platform firmware is that system firmware, I think, is usually used to refer to the quote-unquote BIOS, right? It's usually the silicon initialization code that we talked about, plus the payload, like EDK2 or Linux boot or whatever, right? That gives you the interfaces to the operating system. So we have been focused on that area quite a bit in the past, right? That was why the term Open System Firmware project. Now with the expansion to the platform firmware, well, I don't know if there's any better words, but the group of us decided to use this term platform firmware to mean that system firmware, the BIOS, that piece is still part of it, but we want to also cover for device firmware, right? How the system firmware interacts with for example, the BMC side of things or the device firmware, right? When we say firmware updates, it's not just the system firmware or the BIOS that needs to be updated, but there could also be all these devices which also contain firmware that needs to be updated in a secure manner as well, right? So we are trying to say that this project is not limited to only the system firmware side. Where it matters, we want to also cover the other areas. No, OpenBMC, that's an interesting question. OpenBMC is a different project that's, I think it's in the Linux Foundation, right? So it already has its home, but there, it uses the, the Linux kind of environment to develop the software and so on that is sit on the BMC. That's all fine. That's continued to go in that space. But there are certainly also the communications that we have to have between the system firmware side to BMC, right? Passing the telemetry, passing the, information around, RAS support or control, power control or whatever, right? All these things, there may need to be some coverages in this group to help, the usage of BMC and the update of these BMC software in that space as well. Of course, security also. Yeah, so it's we're not writing the OpenBMC here, but we are trying to support the rest of the infrastructure that deals with BMC as well.
Anyhow, please.
Within the open platform firmware umbrella, I believe you're looking at core boot is one of the ways to implement the firmware. Are you also looking at the UEFI, the one which typically used today, also part of OPF, or that is not part of scope, not in the scope of OPF?
Well, I think traditionally, right, we are very inclusive, and we supported two work streams in the past. One deals with Linux boot, right? And one dealt with the EDK2. I think the term was Open EDK2 or whatever. So we are not restricted to any particular firmware technology, right? Code bases. So in terms of Linux boot, for example, I can speak for my ARM experience that we initially used the mini EDK2 support to load the Linux boot payload, but then we got feedback that there are certain, vendors and people want to remove the minimum EDK2 support. Fine, we worked with Nill and others. I think 9 Elements as well, probably in the audience somewhere, right? We now have core boot supported, from the trusted firmware, and then it loads up the Linux boot also, and I think these kind of efforts would be covered in this kind of areas.
Okay, so you're not excluding UEFI, EDK2.
Yeah.
No, UEFI is just an interface. I think
yeah.
there's always a confusion, like, UEFI, UEFI is just interface, right?
Mm-hmm.
So EDK2 is one way of exposing the UEFI interface. Right. You could actually also use U-boot in the embedded space to support UEFI. We have done that.
I see. Okay.
And you could also have Linux boot load a payload that gives you the UEFI interface as well. So we are inclusive of all that.
Yeah, in our current solutions, so Linux boot focuses on the pure software features, network stack, setup, operation kind of things. For the code, but for the interface, we still keep on the UEFI. But for the implementations, we can use the EDK2 core boot. But right now, for our internal solutions for core boot, we still have minimal UEFI interface. We still build the minimal UEFI interface for the OS handoff. Yes.
Maybe one last question. There's another work stream within OCP that is working on the accelerator firmware update interface spec definition.
You mean the
collaborating?
Accelerator
GPU
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
firmware update? Yeah.
Are you guys collaborating or completely independent?
I actually don't know.
We have some session discussion in the OSF, the meetings, weekly meeting. And in last summit, they are section here. So we have some collaboration, but no much deeply, yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think that effort started in the server group, right?
Before they trying to create some workstream here, they some reason they build the workstream to other area.
Yeah,
some
it'll be
other
good to collaborate.
Yes, yes, yeah. I think
yes.
that's one of the reasons of that expansion of scope,
Yeah.
right? Because that was not part of the system firmware per se, but it is now the platform firmware.
Yeah,
Yes.
and you also mentioned there's some overlap with RAS also, so let's make sure we collaborate with hardware for
Yeah. So
Yes.
part of this expansion is to try to make us not siloed. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yes, before we focus on the host firmware, application processor host firmware, but right now we have extended our scope
To
so
drivers.
security, chiplet, firmware
Yeah.
update areas.
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, our time is up. I got the indication from Jean-Marie, so let me grab my sheet to introduce the next speaker.
Okay, thank you.